you come up, you'll see this screen, and it's just what you look like live, but you can tilt it down because everything seems to be working. Okay. Well, congratulations to both teams. All the best for round 2, and I will close out the space.
It is only when you are able to step back from the relationship at the end with the most amount of clarity and understanding that you were able to experience the most amount of growth and feel that you carry in your future relationships. 3 things I'm going to do in my speech today. Firstly, I'm going to do some setup. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how this is perceived as better on our side of the house. And lastly, I'm going to talk about change. Firstly, on some setup then. 1, what is this debate about? It is about how individuals look back and perceive their past relationships. And I think this is true because it is the easiest way to weigh up the utility, and it is impossible to weigh up the utility objectively of each individual relationship, because I think that people respond incredibly different to relationships. People perceive the relationships to have different value. But B is that this debate is solely about the weigh up between the duration and the end of a relationship. This means that nothing tangibly actually changes, and actors do not respond to the weigh up. This isn't a narratives debate. But secondly, in terms of the types of relationship, I think are within the scope of this debate. 1, I think the majority of good relationships just do not end in the first place, which means that it is just a minimal it just doesn't really include in this debate, right? This is where we frame out the particularly tight relationships, for example, parents, because I think that estrangement is just not very common, and people are just biologically wired to love people in their family or particularly close friends. And I think that this means that these majority of relationships just will not end, even particularly like the familial or the really, really close relationships. But B, I think that most people just do not consider a lot of relationships ended, even when people drift away from each other, right? Remember, this debate is about perception. This means that even if you gradually shift away from your high school friends once you go to university, you would still consider these people from high school your friends, and you will still think incredibly fondly of them and occasionally reach out and catch up, right? This means that these relationships probably still exist, and they probably never ended in the first place. I don't think it is within the scope of this debate, which means then that you have incentives to maintain these relationships. I think this debate is about the bad relationships, the ones that explicitly end, where you have to cut ties and explicitly distance yourself. Yes.
For a person who just broke up with their partner, they want to get the most understanding and pleasure as best as they can. How does looking at the abrupt ending give you more answers than looking at how it lasted?
Okay, I'm actually going to deal with this in my second point on perception. I will explicitly flag response to this POI when it does come up. Firstly then, how do relationships uniquely provide value to people? And this is going to explain how you should actually weigh up this debate, right? Note here this is going to be preemptive of people explaining, offside negating explaining that people are going to be years and years of relationship, which tangibly changes individuals, right? 1, the amount of utility you gain from each relationship is incredibly difficult to quantify objectively. But 2, we're fluid, dynamic beings, which means that we are constantly changing, right? This means that even if a relationship lasts for decades, we think that without the relationship, you are likely to change in response to your other lived experiences, right? We are dynamic beings who respond to our environments, all of which means then that the change that you gain from a relationship is just very ununique, right? But 3, we think that relationships provide a unique value to people in the way in which they reflect back upon them, right? This means that this is the most recent part of the relationship that feel the most visceral. And this proves to you why perception is probably going to be the main metric you could judge this debate upon. It just proves to you why this point is incredibly important. Okay, now then I'm going to talk about why the end matters so much, and this is going to be explicit response to the POI here. 1, it is the most recent image you have of this individual, right? Because you can remember it the most viscerally. People have imperfect memory. Your memory is sometimes clouded, right? You cannot remember someone's face after decades. You cannot remember their voice after decades, but you can remember the way in which people communicated to you towards the end of the relationship because it was the most recent, right? Because you can remember things that happened 2 weeks ago, but you probably can't memorize things that happened 10 years ago, right? Your memory is going to cloud, which means the most recent memory you have of someone is going to feel the most real, and it is usually near the end of the relationship, right? This means that even if your toxic partner through the POI is going to end the relationship with you, I think you can see the end of the relationship the most clearly. You can feel it because it was the most recent part of you, right? But 2, in terms of the fact that the the end of a relationship is oftentimes the most dynamic, right? And this is going to be further response to the POI. A, because the ends of relationships are incredibly eventful. People confess to each other things that they could not say during the duration of a relationship. People confront one another and tell them about their preferences, about what went wrong in the relationship. I think that when relationships fall apart, that is when you have a sense of mutual understanding that I no longer want to be with this person, that my partner is incredibly bad for me, right? This means then that I think that when people reflect upon the end of the relationships, particularly in terms of toxic relationships, they feel the most amount of understanding because that is when the most amount of communication occurs. This is when people actually get the most amount of clarity in order to reach the tipping point to leave a relationship in the first place. But B, I think that people reflect upon the duration of the relationships. They think of it in reference to the end of it, right? This means that even if you are able to gain some sort of utility about thinking about the duration of the relationship dynamics are determined by the most recent dynamic between the two people. This means that even independent of the end of relationship, how relationships develop in the first place is based off of your most recent perception of this individual, your most recent interactions that build and change the dynamics between two people. All of which means then the most recent interaction is what dictates your whole relationship. This means that when you reflect upon your abusive partner, you're going to think about all these instances where they showed signs of not loving you, where they showed signs of neglecting you. It is going to be all of these realizations are what you made at the end of your relationship when you reach that tipping point in order to leave in the first place. You carry that that impression of the individual for the rest of your life, all of which means you should weigh this incredibly highly because it's the most visceral, it is what you remember the most, that is the most important point in this debate. But know here that even if you never actually buy any of my framing, that perception is going to be disproved by the aside. Know here I give you so many mechanisms as to why this is perception is the most important. Even if it's not important, we can win on change, right? On to my second point on change. Know here that relationships are dynamic. People move on, and we think of the end of a relationship as an end of a cycle that we can move on and engage in other relationships, right? Okay. Few mechanisms here. One, if you choose to end a relationship, that is incredibly meaningful for you. That is a tipping point in which you choose to move on, right? And note here, this is when you get the most amount of closure. That is when you understand yourself with a lot of clarity that I want to exit this relationship, right? This means then that, it is just good at the end of a toxic relationship that you choose yourself and that you end and you leave, right? But two, you're just going to move on even if other individuals end your relationship and even if you end on bad terms, right? Because if your partner that you love so much leaves you, that is significant. You might feel the pain, you might grieve what you experienced during the duration of that relationship, but I think that the ending is going to be what is significant to you because you're leaving someone who never loved you in the first place. You're leaving someone and you're moving on and pursuing other relationships that are probably going to be a lot better for you. But thirdly, I think you're just going to see most clearly at the end of a relationship. You're going to respond to the relationship the most clearly at the end, which I think it just provides you a lot more utility. But thirdly, you see the relationship in terms of seeing the relationship most clearly at the end point, you are going to step back and you are going to see this relationship as a whole. You are forced to weigh up this relationship when deciding to end it or not, and you can see the successes and failures more clearly when you're realizing what went wrong, right? This means then that is incredibly meaningful. But fourthly, when you end the relationship directly, it influences how you engage in future relationships. For example, things you learned about someone during a breakup is directly changes the way you choose to engage within your next relationship, right? Know here this is because the end of a relationship is the most dynamic. It is when people respond the most. It is when people communicate the most, which provides you the most utility for future relationships, right? Know here this stands independent of perception, and even if you don't buy our framing, you should believe this point, right? Comparatively, one, the duration of relationship is going to confine you, right? But two, it basically just ties you to the past, and three, I think the utility you gain from a relationship during the duration, in terms of changing and being a fluid individual, is just never exclusive to relationships in the first place. At the end of my speech, you should believe that the end of relationship is what matters the most because people can reflect upon it with clear rationality. Basically just changing and being a fluid individual, it's just never exclusive to relationships in the first place. At the end of my speech, you should believe that the end of relationship is what matters the most because people can reflect.
In the great pop song Kill Bill by SZA, she quotes, "Rather be in jail than be alone," and she talks about how she would love to kill her ex. I think that she must have been quite upset that her ex broke it off with her, or maybe she did as well, and that's quite an irrational thought because I personally would not like to kill my ex. But a few things in this debate, firstly on setup, secondly on how our side provides better closure, and thirdly on why the comparative is harmful. And I'll also respond to the perception framing in my second point. But firstly on setup. So what does mattering mean? So on our side, we see that it is what an individual gains. We see that they gain memories that are quite prominent in their relationship, either their family or with their significant other. We also see the values that they learn, which is quite important because they take that into other relationships with other people, which means that they can clearly remember it. I don't think it's something that people quite forget easily. Also on our side, the individual gains a lot of clarity, growth, nuance, and understanding, which we will follow through in our second point. Secondly, on the individuals in relationships, how do we characterize this? In 3 subgroups. Firstly, family. Secondly, friendship. Thirdly, a relationship. So firstly, family. We see that obviously you're in quite a close proximity with, because you're obviously with them since birth, and so that leads to a lot of attachment, which means you're quite, obviously attached to your parents, which when you do end up closing off that barrier, that is quite a difficult thing to endure. Secondly, in friendship, a lot of people care about their friends, especially a lot of people who care heavily because it's the closest relationship they have. Maybe sometimes their family aren't as close with them, so therefore they rely on their friendships, so those are kind of the most important relationships to them. And then thirdly, in relationship, there's a lot of high levels of serotonin and dopamine in this certain relationship because of the, of course, different levels that you're gaining from the different experiences. And so we can see that often you see a lot of irrational thinking and acting on impulse. And then lastly, ending. How do we characterize ending? So for us, we see this as something that stops. We see this as something that you stop engaging with someone or stop talking to them in general, so that can apply to all 3 subgroups. So I'll take a point.
Given that you can think most clearly and be the most honest outside of the relationship when it's ended, do you not get the most closure and change at that point?
I think that you can actually gain more closure if you look at the how the relationship lasted, because there are so many points that you can that you are able to identify and also analyze. So I think that gives you more like material, if you want to say. So I think that that's better in terms of closure. I think the end is quite abrupt and short to be able to like clarify that. So second point on why our side provides better closure. Firstly, in context, we see that humans need closure. How many times do people stay up at night staring at their ceiling, asking themselves why they've been broken up with so abruptly? It's just quite an often a trouble that people have, and so when you analyze the bigger picture, you analyze what happened in that relationship, you get this closure because you're able to identify all the different things which I responded before. Secondly, closure doesn't have to be something that like resolves an issue, but something that helps you understand the trail that you trekked. This is intuitively like a great thing because it helps people understand the course of events that led to the ending of the relationship, especially if it's one that holds like sentiment, like a family relationship. But also I feel like it's not like exclusive on the other side of the house, because when you look at how the relationship lasted, you're also looking at how it ended. I think both ties into each other, and but we just see that our side has more importance because you have more material to look at. For the mix of this, you see that firstly, you get the answers you are looking for. So you're looking at the whole situation. You're looking at both parties, yourself and the others. You can identify issues. You can identify causes of arguments, patterns of behavior, and acknowledge how this relationship came to an end, which is just impactful due to the depth of individual well-being, because our side highly weighs that in this debate. Not only is the outcome have more clarity and closure, but it allows people to learn from the experiences and take it into account when meeting new people or like creating new relationships with others, which is intuitively a good thing. My second point on why focusing on how it ended is a bit harmful. So for context, we see that focusing on how it ended is something that maybe give you answers, but I feel like the endings are generally very unclear due to it being very irrational, especially in relationships, and like something that's quite toxic, and especially in this generation, not many people are ending their relationships with like paragraphs and paragraphs of, this is why I broke up with you because of so and so. Like, I just feel like people are like, oh yeah, I don't like you anymore, that's it. And so it's kind of like out of nowhere, the endings usually are. And so the mix of this is that firstly, endings are generally more like sometimes traumatic due to it being a very like hard experience with lots of emotions, because that means you're not focusing on the bigger picture, but rather what hurt you the most, which is quite like a blindsided thing, which could impact the individual negatively. Secondly, we see that even if you don't believe that many endings are traumatic, most are sad, and often both parties are that. And so focusing on the end often leaves a person wondering like if they could have prevented it, which is further creates more harm to the person, because now they're stuck on that when they could just identify everything and like come to terms with it. And so comparatively, we provide these answers, and Af's world just leaves them sad and wondering. The impacts of this is that because you decided not only to only look at the traumatic ending, emphasizing it means that you never get the real meaning behind why it ended, or at least like at best a little understanding. Yet it's often very blurry because you're looking at one part of the equation. It's like when you look at a math question and you look at the answer, you're not going to identify what the answer is if you don't look at the equation itself. A lot of people work backwards. That's how I like to do math. So for an impact of this, in Af's world, you see that you remain stagnant in your beliefs, and you continue to make the same mistakes because you never get to understand the like red flags that are given to you beforehand, and only acknowledge something harmful when it's like extreme enough to constitute the end of a relationship. Like an abusive relationship, you kind of forget about the red flags that have appeared before because they have like convinced you to be able to stay. And so when you look at the one thing is that they hurt me really bad, you're forgetting all the other things that they did as well, and I think that's quite harmful. And so the incentive for this is that people like don't want to be in a bad situation. That's just like something intuitive. And when you're deeply hurt and like only focused on the ending, you might like alternatively shut yourself out from like other relationships out of like fear and security. So like Af's world incentivizes people to be able to like kind of shut themselves out, which is a bad thing, because on our side, comparatively, we provide the incentive to pursue future relationships, because you are analyzing what happened in that past relationship and taking that further into something else. And so because you understand that not everybody shows these red flags, like that just gives you more capacity, which I will talk about now. So another impact is that the immediate effects of our side of the house is that when you look at the content and duration of a relationship, you gain the capacity to take more like precautions. You get to analyze issues that pop up more effectively, and you just have the capacity to like apply the knowledge into other relationships, because you are able to have that like learning curve, and you're able to put that into other things. And one last thing is that when you bake bread, you sometimes have like a wrong way of doing it, right? And so when you bake bread and it turns out really, really bad, you're not just focusing on how it tastes, you're looking at what went wrong in the recipe. How do I fix this? How do I put better ingredients in to make this bread much more better and luminous and everything? So I just think that we help in many ways with both bread and in relationships. And that's why we're proud to affirm.
I don't realize that my bread has turned into mush until I actually eat it. That is the point at which it matters, because that is the point at which I realize I'm a terrible baker and should never have stepped foot in the kitchen. A couple of things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about some framing, what actually matters in this debate, what does the emotion actually mean. Secondly, I'm going to talk about changes that you get during the duration of the relationship that they claim. Thirdly, about closure / how you feel after the relationship. And fourthly, I'm going to bring up their final point on harms. But before that, I'm going to do my split substantive contribution on toxic relationships. Firstly, notice that this should be an incredibly weighted point in this debate because, one, most people experience a toxic relationship at some point in their life. This doesn't necessarily look like an abusive relationship. It could be somebody using you for something you did for them at some point in time. It could be a relationship that affects you really harmfully throughout. I think most people experience this. Even if you don't believe this, I think the people who do experience this, especially at a high degree, are an extremely vulnerable stakeholder, and their experience should count really highly in this debate. So why is it so much worse to emphasize the duration of a relationship, right? Why does the end matter more? Because the moment you break away from a relationship, I think says the most about your character. It says the most about who you are. Note that this should be incredibly weighted because who you are is the most tangible part of this debate, and is the part that will affect the individual for the rest of their life. It will affect all of their future relationships. Is who the person that they are is at the end of this, right? This says far more about you. The end matters far more because everybody's able to be manipulated. Everybody's able to make poor decisions. Everyone is able to go through hard times in which you fall for something you shouldn't have, right? But that one good decision you make at the end of that relationship, when you leave it, when you choose to stand up for yourself, when you choose to actively weigh up the relationship and choose to, leave it, that is incredibly important. That says far more about your character. That should be really heavily weighted, right? And then note too that the end is the only active decision that anyone can claim in this debate. It is the only tangible decision you actually make. It is a direct decision and choice that you make to leave a relationship. That should be incredibly important because that is the only thing you can point to as I did this exclusive thing. All the stuff might have happened to me throughout the relationship, but I chose to end it. This is why the end matters far more because it's one says far more about the person, but two is just far more influential to who this person actually is. Okay, on then to some framing. And I tell you that what matters is what a person gains from it, right? We tell you that perception should also be incredibly important for all the reasons we give to you at Lucy. But I also want to note here that I think mattering is what they gain from it. It's just incredibly loose and vague framing, right? Because it's incredibly intangible, hard to quantify what you gain from it. If you were married to someone for 20 years, how do you quantify oh, I got this value from them, but then I got this value from my friends who were part of our friend group at the time, right? If you have 3 siblings and you get estranged with one of them, how do you know what value you got from this person versus what value you got from your other sibling? I think we need to hear more mechanizing here about how you actually gain things, what does this actually look like, right? And then 2, we said that largely what you gain from a relationship is a result of the culture or the lifestyle that you were living at the time, right? Not necessarily that person. I.e., if you were in a relationship with someone while you were growing up, yeah, you might have learned a lot of things, but that's probably things you would have learned anyways from growing into a young adult. There's nothing exclusive they bring you about how they can claim what matters is what you gain from it. We need to hear more about this if there's ever to be a metric that they could win on. Okay, secondly, let's talk about changes that you get throughout the relationship because they tell you that you learn skills and ideas and things from your relationships. A couple things here. Firstly, I think we just framed this out when I tell you before that it's very difficult to quantify this. Note that there's also a lot of other things going on in your life at the same time. Very hard to measure what you actually gain directly from this, especially in terms of meaningful change, i.e. what changes you as a person. Very difficult to quantify. But secondly, we tell you that we outframe this again when we tell you that you change on either side of the house, right? Because Lucy tells you people are dynamic, fluid beings, because Lucy tells you that the way your lifestyle is always going to change, your environment is always going to change you. Therefore, it's very unclear why the specific relationship of the environment that they bring you is more impactful than the change that you would have gotten anyways, right? It's impossible not to change throughout your life. It is impossible to not have this benefit that they claim. This benefit was always symmetric, right? But then 3, we tell you this is wrong because you don't actually change significantly throughout a relationship, at least not comparatively to the end, right? Why is this? Because when a relationship is going on, note that it is consistent, right? As in nothing changes significantly because you stay in the relationship, right? What this means then is that your behaviors are reinforced throughout it, right? If you do something in the relationship and then your relationship continues, why would you ever have an incentive to change that? They never give you these mechanisms. What this means then is that because your behaviors are largely being reinforced, you're not actually changing. Therefore, the point at which you do change is the ending and the comparative, right? Because that is the big tipping point. That is the big moment of change. That is when you realize that something you've been doing is wrong, some experience you've been having is not correct, something that you've been actively believing is not correct, right? That is the point at which you get change because that is the point you are forced to make change. Note that when people reflect on relationships and reflect on the point they change is, right? The moment at which they believe that they've changed is the ending, right? If you talk to a divorcee of 30 years, when they believe they changed is when they finally chose to leave that husband, when they were forced to go in the uncomfortable situation that wasn't the comfortable relationship they had, when they were forced to go step out into the world, decide who they are as a person. That is actually what made them change, not the 30 years of sustained just being in a relationship where all their behaviors were reinforced because the relationship just continued. Okay, next here they talk to you about closure / what you get after a relationship. They tell you that you can understand events that lead to the end and you have more to go on, you can identify patterns, right? A couple things here. One, I want you to note that when people look back on a relationship that ended, they don't usually actually consider the duration of the relationship and they don't like look for these patterns, right? Because often, if the relationship is ended, you don't want to look back on it because it's hurtful, right? It reminds you of things you no longer have or reminds you of things that you wish you never had gone through, right? This means that I don't think like the extent to which this actually applies to people is as significant as they want you to claim, right? I think what people genuinely do consider, however, is the ending because that is the moment at which they see as like the standout point from the relationship. That is the moment at which they see that things all came falling apart. That is where they identify the red flags that have been there the whole time, right? And then secondly, we say that all of these things they tell you about, like patterns, things like that, they're only apparent to you at the ending because that is the point at which you realize the relationship has failed. You're not looking for these things when you're in the relationship. You're not looking for these things in the duration of the relationship because you believe that this is fine, right? If you're still in the relationship. The moment at which you start actually looking for them, the moment at which you start believing there were like patterns and red flags to pick up on in the first place is the ending. That is what is most important. Okay. Next, like, finally here on the idea of like harmfulness and like the harm it can bring to actors, right? I want you to note at the top of this that this was never a narratives debate. The actors are not being changed. All of the mechanisms they give you around the incentives they provide to people to focus and emphasize on things, they never stood because this debate does not change anything about the world. We outframe this when you read the motion for one time. Okay, but secondly, I'm going to take them at their best. I'm going to pretend that this is actually like a meaningful point in this, okay? They tell you that it's harmful for people to focus on the ending. I think this is not true, because I think the ending uniquely gives you closure. Note this is responsive to a lot of the things they tell you about closure and the POI, right? The ending is far more healthy for you to focus on because A, if you're focusing on the duration, you're focusing on what you could have had, what you could still have, you're focusing on like what could have been, you're focusing on like this delusional aspect of like maybe I could still get in this. That is when people reach a really negative and unhealthy state after relationships. That is when people get lost in the past. What is far more conducive is to focus on like what is the actual outcome of this, forget why it happened, forget all of the like leading fluff up to it. What is the actual result I need to gain from this to go forward in my life? The actual result you need to gain from this is that it is over. Is that these are the relationships, these are the reasons why it is over, these are the reasons you shared about, right? I'm going to whip a lot of Lucy's material here because I don't think it was ever responded to. This realizations that you get about what went wrong is so incredibly influential to how you go like move forward in your life, right? Because I've already told you why you focus more on this, but even if you don't, the lessons that you learn from the end of this directly impacts how you enter your next relationship in the next 2 weeks. That is so incredibly important. That is the only actual benefit anyone can claim in this debate is how it impacts the individual.
I can't lie, y'all. They got me sweating because someone read the road motion wrong, and I'm gonna hope it's not us. All right, let me explain what this motion actually means within this debate. Bear in mind that if you're reflecting on the past, it probably already ended. Obviously, like, you can't have an end without no duration, right? You can't have a sandwich with no bread. That doesn't make any sense, okay? Right? And your bread sucks. All right, let's talk about it, y'all. All right. So first off, let me clarify what this motion actually means within this debate. It means that yes, it's gone, it's ended, ship sailed, goodbye. But we're looking at, how it happened. Like, we're looking at the meat. They just look at the sad little floppy bit at the end of the bread, right? Like the end, like the bottom bit of the sandwich. You know, the butt part. No one likes that, right? But anyways, let's talk about two things I'll do for you in today's debate. First off, I'll talk about setup. Second off, I'll give you my split on character growth and how that is better on our side of the house. Bear in mind that there probably will be some weird substantives here and there. Keep up. All right. First off, setup. What do they tell us? Well, they tell us that the first thing I want to respond to is like they tell us like all good things don't end, which is just like when you say it like that, it just sounds wrong because it is wrong, right? Like, good to say that a good thing doesn't end is just inherently flawed because yes, like, oh, you want to keep in like good contact with these friends, but like, be honest, if you had a good mate from like 20 years ago, bro, you're not talking to him. You gotta go pay your bills. You gotta go marry your wife, take care of your kids, right? Like, you have other things to do, and we're not saying like, obviously, it's not a bad thing, but there are other instances. But also, you know, the second they tell us, it's like, oh, the ending is the most reliable, the most recent image. You think if I beat the dead horse 8 times, it's gonna look the same from when it was alive? No! The dead horse is, like, mauled on the ground, right? Like, and they tell us that, like, you know, these endings, they're dynamic and like, oh, I don't like you because you stole my croissant in the fridge. No, it's gonna look like I can't say any of these words. You're bad! You're ugly! You're rotund! Right? Like, nobody is, like, no, there's like 3 people in the world that will give you a full-on essay like, I don't like you because you're so ineloquently inefficient of whatever, right? Most of these endings are just like, you're fat, you're ugly, I don't like you, right? These to say that an ending is dynamic and it gives you the whole perception, it's like if I like step 2 feet away from this whiteboard and went, wow, that's a nice whiteboard, and then I step 20 feet away from the whiteboard and went, wow, it's a lot bigger than I thought, because it is, alright? But even then, right, like, at best, we see that most of these endings, like, at best only lead to a one-way understanding. It's not the mutual benefit that they like to think it is, right? Because, again, like, most of these endings, not productive, man. They're really not. But anyways, second response. So what do they tell us? They tell us 2 things. They tell us, like, oh, we get good change on the house. So what is the response to this? So, first off, you know, they're like, oh, I move on. Because, yeah, they tell us, like, oh, you move on when you look at the end. Which just is inherently not true. Because, why? Well, because the end, like I've already told you, tends to be very angry. Tends to be like, oh, I don't like this guy. So you're probably gonna dog on him like 300 million times. Opposed to if you look at the more nuanced thing, where it's like, okay, he did this because I did that. You're not gonna beat that dead horse as many times, right? Because you see a better, more clear thing, right? And the second thing they tell us is like, oh, you know, we get a clearer response on our side of the house. But like I've already told you, like, 1, the end is such a vague thing, and 2, you know, they give us this response. They give us this example where it's like, oh, I get multiple instances from an end. How many instances are you getting from a 2-minute clip, right? Because I think if I saw a 2-hour film, I would see more clips than your 2-minute end credit thing, right? Like, who even looks at the end credits? Anyways, the second thing they tell us is like, oh, you know, we get a better incentive to change, right? Couple responses, 2 responses actually to this, is that 1, actually, that's false. Why? We have better incentive to change because we get it through pattern recognition. Because again, if you're looking at the whole thing, you're like, he did this time, he did it on Wednesday, he did it on Thursday, he did it on Friday, right? If you just look at the end, you're just gonna like think that he did it the one time because you're not looking at the full picture.
Point of information.
Yeah, I'll take that actually.
How are you defending your side of the motion if you're saying you can only do this all at the end of the relationship?
Because the relationship has ended, right? The ship has sailed. I've already told you this. But you're not reflecting on the 2-minute clip and credit. You're seeing the whole film, right? Like, I think both sides of the house agree. Yeah, ship sailed, goodbye. But we're telling you to look at the whole freaking movie. Stop being a LARPer, alright? But anyways. So then what else do they tell us? Well, from the split we hear at second, they tell us that, like, you know, like, these toxic relationships that do matter, you know, breaking away is the only way you're gonna have identity, and it's the only active decision you ever make within this, like, you know, relationship, what have you, right? And, like, yes, we do agree that, like, breaking away from a toxic relationship is a good thing. It should empower you, right? But we also think that you should probably avoid toxic relationships, which you do better on our side of the house, because it's like, yes, you will feel empowered on their side of the house, but comparatively, you're only looking at, oh, he hit me, so I'm gonna avoid people that hit me. You didn't see the instance where he manipulated you. You didn't see the instance where he called you mean things in that dress you really wanted to hear. You don't hear those instances. And so when someone else when you pursue another relationship, and you're like, you know, yeah, like, you only end it when he hits you. You don't recognize the pattern of, like, oh, he called me fat like the other guy. Oh, he called me ugly like the other guy. Sorry, I'm using these words. I don't know if I'm allowed to. But anyways, right? Like, you don't get that pattern recognition on their side of the house. In their best case, you only recognize it in the most extreme cases, which most people will not, like, show you until, you know, you get really into it, really deep in there. And that's gonna hurt real bad, right? But secondly, you know, we have nuance, which, like, they can kind of claim, but their nuance is like, again, 2-minute clip, 20-hour doco. Which one do you think has more info in it, right? I'll tell you right now, it's the 20-hour doco, right? But anyways, like, even if the guy that's reflecting is like the stupidest person on the planet, just you have more content, which then means that you can reflect more, which, you know, we just get more reflection, more content. That's great, right? So anyways, what else? No. So anyway, sorry. What else do we hear from that side of the house? Well, you know, they tell us that, like, oh, you know, people are always changing anyways. So it's like, yeah, people are always changing, but they change better on our side of the house, right? But what else did they tell us? Well, they tell us that. They tell us that, like, but then they also contradict themselves because they're like, oh, actually, you don't change in a relationship. It's consistent. It's reinforced. So am I changing or am I left, right? Like, am I changing or am I not changing, right? Please, right? We think that we do, like, yes, you do change on both sides of the house. However, like we've already told you again and again and again, you know, you change better on our side of the house, right? Also, this point about perception on change, quick response to that is like, yeah, you perceive what you're doing, which is changing. So obviously you're going to perceive your change. So you're still going to perceive a change on our side of the house, right? Oh my gosh, I have 30 seconds. All right, wrapping time. Character growth. All right, why do we get more character growth on our side of the house? Well, for context, you know, people don't want to end up in bad situations. That's just an intuitive thing. 3 mechanisms for this point. First off, you look at the full picture, which growth understanding. Oftentimes, people are looking for the answers to questions. Again, think like late at night. Oh my gosh, she broke up with me. Bye. Oh, when I look at that whole situation, oh, it's because I forgot her birthday. Oopsies, right? But secondly, right, you don't have to condone these things. You just understand why they did it, which is still like a good thing to pursue for future relationships. And 3, it helps how you approach situations and the preemptive outcomes of this. We get better intuitive for future relationships, and you just get better quality of relationships because you have that intuition. At the end of the debate, what you have to believe is that our bread is cooler.
If you believe that this debate existed outside of a vacuum and that individuals can pursue other relationships at the same time or in the future pursue relationships, but also that they live in a society where there are countervailing narratives that give them other incentives that co-opt a lot of their benefits, then you believe that we make the most change in the future, that we get the best relationships, and that we deal with actually what matters, not that what you should focus on, I think we win this debate. I'm going to answer 3 questions. Firstly, on what the debate's actually about. Notice I tried to strawman what we tried to frame, and then I'm going to talk about what closure and change actually looks like and what this actor interacts, but also clarifying their things on focusing, and then lastly on future relationships. Notice here are WIP toxic relationships, because I think where we get the most magnitude of change and where you should buy the most of the material in the future, why it matters the most to these individuals. Firstly, on what the debate actually is about, because they tried to tell us at Second Neg that we claim that it's not about the end and that you don't get this closure. We believe that the ship has been sailed, that we told you that there was an end, and that's necessarily why you get like things like more clarity, etc. We gave you that analysis. What we were actually actually claiming was that they can't claim actors act in a certain way because that's not the debate about. The debate is about the opinion on what matters, not what they should focus on and whether you get stagnation. That means that all their analysis on things like incentives and how actors act don't matter in this debate because it's it's about what matters, not what people should focus on, what actually changes things. I'll integrate the rest of this and where it necessarily brings down a lot of their analysis and why it fails their case. Onto closure and change. Because notice again that their push on closure and stagnation and all these harms that they tell you relies on these actors actually focusing on it and spending all their time on it. Our claim was never this, it's that this is where you get the most clarity and that's why it matters the most, not that they should focus this time here. That's not our claim, they can't strawman that. I think though, we have responses to why it's not necessarily the case anyway, because we told you that you can't stagnate, firstly because there are other narratives. This debate does not exist in a vacuum. I think if you have things like jobs, if you have other relationships to pursue, if you have things like support systems, people don't just have one relationship, then you necessarily can move on, and there are other things that incentivize you to do so. But I think secondly, you have things like a job, you have things that means that outside of relationships, you have other things that you own obligations and responsibilities to. But I think thirdly, necessarily if you buy that you get stagnation, we tell you that you get a better future on our side because of things like toxic relationships. I'm going to whip this at the end and make it really clear why this is so important. Okay, what do they tell us? They tell us that you seek answers from the relationship at the end, and that you get a lot better answers if you look at the relationship as a whole, not just the end. We told you that you have we told you though that firstly, again, you can't buy any of their things on stagnation, but we told you again and again that they never dealt with was that you get more clarity, because now you're no longer in love, now you're no longer in their arms, you're no longer experiencing these really visceral and like biased feelings. Now you can step back, it's the first time you can do so, you view them in a different light, now you get more clarity. But I think secondly, you get more honesty, because now they don't have an obligation to you to make you feel good and to make you actually happy in the relationship. The greatest extent of response here was that you get detached and therefore you don't even see them again and they just completely dissociate. But I think even if you buy that's true, firstly, you can just hear from other people, because notice that if you're in a relationship in the first place, you're probably proximal. This means that you have other friends that probably go around and it just gets down like the vine. You can hear it through other ways. Notice this is probably the most honest way you hear it, because now it's not to your face and they can say what they want. That's where you get the most honesty. You can't just buy that you can, because if you buy the relationship is so bad, you should never go to it in the first place. But I think their best case though is that you learn about the whole thing and that it is something that you can do this. Notice this deals with their response that because they try to tell us that good relationships with bad endings exist, and this is a massive benefit they get on their side. But if you buy this as true, this means that in their best case they shouldn't focus on the relationship itself, because if it's good you learn nothing. You should outweigh this, because when you focus on the end, when you focus on what went wrong, you can actually learn for the future. You can learn instead of getting a warped understanding if you buy their analysis on why these relationships are so bad. I'm going to whip here the really important stuff on why the actual duration and the growth of the relationship didn't matter, because we told you that you change either way, that we are dynamic human beings. They never responded to this. They tried to create this debate in a vacuum. That was never where it was held. At the end of I'll take a PY from the phone.
Do you actually think it's hard to step back and look at like a problem during the relationship instead of just the end?
Let's step into the shoes of what it looks like to be in a relationship. Because if you're in a romantic relationship, you firstly experience the feelings of love. You feel like overwhelming sensation towards this person. You feel like they are the greatest person. But secondly, you feel an obligation. You feel like you have to because the reason you pursue the relationship is for it to be the best, so that you can stay in for it the longest. You have obligations to that person so that you actually stay in it. You don't want to hurt their feelings. No, you cannot step back, because that means you have to be honest. That ruins the relationship. I think you should buy why this closure is so important, because we win on their turf. They tried to tell you that you get the most answers, you get the most closure. In our worst case, even if we don't get all the answers, we get the ones that don't warp your understanding. We get the ones that actually improve future relationships. This is where the debate should lie. I think that necessarily proves why we're winning on their own turf. Now let's prove why we win on toxic relationships on future ones as well. We told you that toxic relationships are where you buy the most of their analysis, where they are the most manipulative, where they have the most manipulation going on. I think that means then you can just magnify a lot of the impacts that we give on the things like getting greater clarity, getting the most honesty. This is where the debate actually lies. This is where you can get the greatest margins of victory. But I think, though, they never sufficiently dealt with the fact that there are future relationships. Because sure, maybe you can now get better answers from the relationship as a whole, and now you can understand like all of the good things that have happened if you buy why they were good and relationships with bad endings. But this doesn't deal with the fact that now you can't focus so much on the ending, because maybe that 20 seconds at the end of the movie is not representative of the whole thing, but this is where the relationship is in its most developed form. This is where everything has come out and all the red flags that they want to tell you about have actually come out. This is where the end actually exists. I think this means two things. Because firstly, now the actors, if they want to buy like that these people are actually doing things in this debate, have the most agency because they can understand red flags the most. Now they aren't going back to the relationship that manipulated them in the first place by their own analysis, but now you're stepping back the most and you're getting the most developed understanding and the most real understanding of the relationship. But I think secondly, you just get a full perception, because if you buy this manipulation, that is necessarily bad. Why should you care about these future relationships the most? Because I've flagged to you again and again that they never dealt with, is that this debate is not in a vacuum. What matters is what firstly creates the most change for these people, which is why we're talking about future relationships, but also just whether they thought the relationship itself was sufficient. That was where perception came in. That was where we won from first and down the line. You should care about these future relationships. You should care about the fact that they have other people in their lives outside of this. We equip them best to do this. You should care about that.
Starting my debate in 3, 2, 1. Adjudicators, in a debate, what is the most important thing about a substantive point? The impact, or how you got to that impact in the first place? That is what you should really focus inside this debate. See, how you got to the impact, the mechanisms, the line of analysis is looking back and analyzing how did that happen in the first place. But when you only focus on the impact because you can just remember the impact more easier, just doesn't really make sense, because that impact would never occur without that line of analysis happening. Two clashes in today's debate: which side gains more closure and which side allows for the better decision making and development for these actors. But which side gains more closure? What do we tell you? We tell you it's intuitively true that when you analyze the relationship and how it lasted, and you analyze the long term, the whole story, you generally just get more information. That is something that immediately happens and probably should just be weighed is true on our side of the house. You just get more information. We tell you that is very important because we've already highlighted on both sides of the house that answers is probably what these people care about the most. They want closure, they want these answers, and we tell you intuitively, the more you know, the more answers you get. So therefore that should be true. But we tell you, we do this by we also tell you how by focusing on how it lasted, you're able to reflect and see the red flags that happened in the first place and how the ending occurred. And you're more likely to think more clearly, because we already tell you the ending is a traumatic experience. We tell you that you can never overlook and think clearly about something traumatic, especially as you both highlight that these are extremely close relationships, like your parents, like your married husband. You can never look back on that traumatic experience and the ending with a clear view. And I feel like it's very uncharitable just to say, oh, they have friends at work, so they're gonna look at it in a clear view. We tell you that's very unrealistic, and sense check, people have built these connections for years for them to have an extreme point of view. Your work friends are not just gonna override it, and we tell you because these experiences are so traumatic, and because inherently everyone thinks they're in the right, you're more likely to look at this situation in a blind eye. But we tell you it's far more clearer to look at the past times because it's not as traumatic. And when it's not as traumatic to look at what were the red flags at the beginning, you look for it as a much more clearer view. I feel like we were able to mechanize that through our whole case, that it probably should be true and should be weighed in this debate, and so much more. But on the comparative, you just generally get less answers when you look at something much more smaller. I think it's intuitively believe that it's true that when you only see the impact of the ending, you're less likely to get the most answers in the first place. But we tell you that the ending, the opposition says that your true self comes out of the ending because that's where everything comes out. But we tell you that not all endings happen that way in the first place. Some people just go on ghost. I feel like if we take it at the best and say that you get your true self when the ending occurs,
I feel like that should be marginal because it's such an extreme case. I feel like what most endings actually look like. I feel like you should buy into our case more because we paint the most common endings. Is that people just say, I want to break up with you. I like generally people don't want to make the worst ending possible. Like, I want to break up with you because you're ugly. I hate everything about you. They generally want to put it in a more charitable way. Like, oh, it's not you, it's me. Like, let's try to avoid the answer. So yeah, so even if you take it at the best and say the true colors come out, I feel like it shouldn't be debate winning because it's such like a rare case to happen in the first place. But they also talk about like the most recent image and how the past is very blurry, but the ending is most recent, so it allows for like clear perception. But as we already told you that we both agree that these relationships are very important and traumatic, and to say that you'll just forget what happened. Like if your husband was abusing you, it was like, I can't remember when he abused me because it was so long ago. I can only figure out when we broke up. I feel like to say that you just forget a traumatic relationship and the red flags that happen, it's just something that just doesn't make sense in the first place. Like you can't just forget how. You can't forget you and your dad's relationship growing up. And as we said, these are extremely close relationships. And just to forget all the bad things he did to you is very they're kind of reaching, you know? It's like, I feel like it's kind of a reach. But we say that what is more realistic is that you can probably remember what your dad hitting you after you didn't clean the dishes. Like, you can probably remember this because those are... Yeah, I'll take you on.
With the ending of the culmination of the relationship, why does reflecting on the end not give you the most meaningful info you can?
Because that's if the ending is inherently gives you all the answers. Because endings never clearly give you all the answers. As we already told you, like you can never figure out the whole to say that you know how the relationship lasted just because of an instance of an ending doesn't really tell the whole picture. We tell you because endings are very unique. As I said, every person's unique. So people probably end relationships in different ways based on how they're brought up, how they're grown up, and you can never you can't just say that you know everything after just seeing an ending because that's the end of the big relationship. It's very unrealistic. But what can confirm? I feel like we're able to confirm that you get the most answers because you decide to look back at the red flags. I feel like you get a more clarity when you look back because it's a less traumatic experience. They haven't rebutted that it is a traumatic experience, and I feel like we're able to prove how people are most likely to look in a blurry, not right looking glasses when they look at these problems. Yeah. They also try to say how people reminisce about the past and which makes it worse. I feel like reminiscing about the past is inherently, if we take it that they'll do reminisce, I feel like it's a good thing. Because if you're just gonna think negatively after that whole relationship, I feel like that really doesn't broaden your scope. But if you reminisce on the past, the next question the person's gonna ask is what went wrong? What happened to make all those reminiscing good moments go wrong in the first place? And that's because, you're just gonna look at it what's wrong. Yeah, so which side allows for better decision making? Okay. Alright, what else to say? If you get more clarity? Yeah, I'll take you on.
If you find a relationship after negative and are so bad as we want to tell us, how do you now see the red flags when you look at it again when they try to hide them in the first place?
Because if you're having a close relationship with someone like your dad, I feel like it's far more easier to ignore the red flags because you're so close to them in the first place. I feel like it's very easy to ignore your dad hitting you because you guys grew up so close and because you're inherently forced to love him. I feel like it's believed that you'll probably ignore these, but once you already broke off that relationship and you're able to look back on it, I feel like with that new sense of clarity, you're able to see the red flags in the first place. And I feel like that's a mutually exclusive benefit that you get because you look back. Because you can never reminisce about the past when you only look at how it ended, because you just don't do that. And that's even if they end in the way that you guys say it is, where they reveal their true colors, which is a very hard reach. So which side allows for better decision making? We tell you that you get more knowledge, you'll get more nuance when you look back. I feel like you get more lessons, especially when you look at the minor red flags where you're able to ignore. I feel like that's inherently true. And when you look at these red flags, I feel like it's better for you to learn from them because those are inherently mistakes that you made in the past. And I feel like the more mistakes you look back on, especially in the clear review that I feel like we're able to prove to you, the more character development that you'll probably be able to make in the first place. And I feel like when you look back and you see these red flags that you've ignored, I feel like it teaches you better on how to identify them, because when you only focus on the ending, you kind of only see the big red flags. You don't see the little small things that could have made a hint. And I feel like those big red flags you see at the ending is probably already someone already knows to ignore them. Like if someone calls you like the B word at the end, like I'm breaking up with you, bear, then like I feel like someone already knows that's a bad thing. But if so how do they say go through the act of decision. I feel like decision at the ending is like very unique. Like I feel like it's very hard to claim that people's true colors will come out, especially because people inherently want to be good. Most communication, we proved. So this debate, you should prove that we get most communication, most everything, and yeah, proud to you, negate.
In this debate, we've seen and heard a lot of analogies. We've had bread, ship sailing, and maths. But actually, in this debate, I have identified a few points of clash, but I'll also embark on why we win this debate. So firstly, on clarity and understanding. Secondly, on what matters in this debate. And thirdly, on change. And who gets it? So firstly, on clarity and understanding. So Af tells us that like the most recent thing that happened is like the most important because that's kind of what you most remember. But we have already proven that that's not true because we've already seen that literally you can have so many different points of a relationship that is a key thing that is kind of ingrained into your brain, and you know you create memories in these relationships, especially with the examples that we've been given: family, friends, and relationships. Those are the most prominent ones where you make the deepest connections, in which you remember all the key parts. So even things like red flags, you remember that. You remember the time that he ratted you out to your friend. I think that that's something that we like actually prove. And we also see that at affirming, we see a lot of high chances of irrationality, which then just leads to like impracticality, because like we weigh real clarity in this debate, and we think that we actually provide this because we allow that step in which you take to look for it. And so you can't really get clarity from the end because that's literally a full stop, when in reality you have to read an entire sentence to be able to understand a part of an essay. And so we also see that secondly, what matters in this debate. So I feel like Af has kind of poured into the fact that like the individual leaving is kind of like the main point, but I think something that they don't have and that we do is that negating like focuses and acknowledges on like all parties in this, because we feel like ending a relationship isn't just like a one-sided thing. Of course there has to be two parties in this, and so we see that we see that parties should be like accounted for in this debate, because we don't know if the person that was broken up with is wrong or the person that did the breaking up was wrong. So we think that like we actually provide like more in depth for like the person that's being assessed. And so we think that also like a lot of people, like for our side, we see that what matters is like people and actors, because like they're the people involved in this debate. And so like what benefits them most, or just what is intuitively like good, like what matters more, the end or the entire thing. Like I just think that it's more intuitively correct that we view like the entire thing, because that's how you usually analyze something in the first place. Thirdly on change, we see that Af thinks that they have changed because the end creates that change. But we tell you that in order to end something, you would obviously have to change your view on the relationship due to what happened in the relationship. And so we actually get the change because we provide we prove literal steps to take to get this. And so change is a long process which we give. And so what do we win on? Firstly, on intuition, because like why duration matters in general, and to like important stakeholders in this debate, which we weigh highly. We prove it like time and time again, from first all the way to third, is that like duration is such a big thing and we shouldn't ignore it and just focus on the end. I think that's not quite That's just not good. We also win on depth because we have a variety of answers that we can conclude with because we have so much content to look out for. We also see better clarity of response because, again, you're not looking at the end, which could be really irrational. And we also see there's like just more content. We also win on scale because we affect people outside of like extremities, like things like abuse and stuff. We also see like normal friendships end like this. And we also win on long term because of like the relationship ended and what matters to look for, like the end or the duration. Usually the duration matters more, and that is why I'm proud to negate. Like things like abuse and stuff, we also see like normal friendships end like this. And we also went on long term because of like the relationship ended, what matters to look for. That is why I'm proud to negate.
During a relationship, you look at your partner through rose-tinted glasses. And the only way you can meaningfully reflect on the duration of a relationship is that you have experienced the moment of clarity and realization at the end. That is the most cathartic part of a relationship. Two things in this reply today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about reflection. Secondly, I'm going to talk about change. So firstly, in terms of reflection, let's look at their case, right? Because note here, they hinge a lot of their case on irrational endings. Note here that not all relationships end in incredibly irrational endings. It's not just, oh, my partner called me fat and hit me, I'm never going to talk to them again. We gave you mechanisms down the line as to why people feel the most amount of clarity at the end of a relationship for reasons that you need to realize the issues to cut ties. You're brought to a tipping point where you actually have to take action, where you reflect upon the duration of your relationship at the end of your relationship in order to actually make this way up and leave a relationship. But even if you, if you believe this rationality push, then all of their framing falls from the get-go. You cannot buy any of their analysis because in the ending, even if it is shorter, it is a tipping point that far outweighs anything else that we are able to get catharsis. Secondly, if you believe that people are irrational at the end of the relationship, they just wash their own case because they want to visualize debate as someone who is looking back on a relationship that is already ended. And if you're irrational either way at the end of the relationship, then all of your analysis is just largely symmetric and you'll never understand anything anyways. You'll never be able to rationalize the duration of your relationship if you're so caught up on your partner calling you the B word, right? This means that what matters is that you left this relationship, you get that catharsis by leaving your misogynist boyfriend and having him out of your life, even if you never get closure. That is the most meaningful thing you can ever experience. But three, we already framed to you that the ending of a relationship is logically prior to them experiencing any of their meaningful reflection, right? Because the ending is a culmination of the relationship. You look back on the red flags at the end of a relationship, whereas during the relationship, you can never actually reflect on these red flags. You can only see them when you're rationalized at the end. But fourthly, even if none of that stands, we still clearly win this debate because they can never win on just reflecting on the duration of relationships alone. Sure, you can wonder what went wrong, but it's just unclear as to how that wins the debate. You can constantly search for answers, but you can never find them, right? We say that ignorance is bliss at our absolute worst. Sure, you think your partner is the B word, but you move on and you do not return. You experience better relationships, and I think that is most meaningful. Now that I'm going to talk about briefly change, right? How does this change point sit in the debate? One, it is the most proximate. It is very intuitive that you just remember and be influenced more by what happened last week than 4 years ago, right? Because even if you can remember the visceral imagery of your father abusing you, I think that you just people tend to forget the specific details. People tend to forget the specific patterns and verbal conversations. I think it is just very intuitive. But secondly, obviously you just get the most amount of clarity, right? This means that most people are just able to see what actually worked and what didn't work at the end of a relationship. And three, when you see the result, which is the most useful information to know, I think that is what's meaningful. The result usually happens at the end of a relationship. But fourthly, even if you never understand the end of a relationship in this debate, even if you never get clarity, even if none of our analysis stands, what matters is that relationship is a closed book and you can seek new relationships and you do not need to dwell on the duration. If he called you ugly, find another man. But at the end of this debate, what should you believe? One, I think, like, weighing toxic relationships, the moment you choose to leave matters far more than understanding an abusive relationship. What matters is you get out of that environment. That is the most meaningful. But two, all of their impacts are contingent on experiencing the end of a relationship. This means then our case exists when you never get understanding. Our case is not contingent. Their case is. At the end of this, buy a new loaf of bread, find a new man.
Good job.